Hey there, welcome to the More Miles podcast. I'm Lauren,
I'm Michelle.
I'm Scott.
and we are the More Miles Run Coaching team. And we are back this week, joined by Thomas and John from Elite Performance Institute, back as our first repeat guests. Thanks, guys, for coming back to join us.
Oh, we're honored.
Thanks for having us.
All right, so in our first episode together, we touched on strength training, how strength training benefits runners, endurance athletes in general. We got into a lot of general kind of basic information about strength training and endurance sport together. I think we all got off of that podcast and thought, gosh, we could talk so much more about this and this and this, and just a lot more depth that we could get into. So that's what we're here to do today. And I think maybe this isn't our last episode together either. I think there's a lot that we can talk about here. But our subject for today is going to be about efficiency and running economy. So a lot of what we discussed in our last episode covered sort of injury prevention and how strength training can both prevent injury and help you work through injuries. What we really want to talk about today is how strength training and running work together to make you a faster, more efficient runner. Faster, further, stronger, those are the things that we're really after. I think injury prevention doesn't come into your thought until you're injured. So we want to talk about the ways that this can make you a better runner, a more efficient runner, and make running easier for you over the long haul. So that's what we're going to jump into today. You guys ready?
Ready.
Let's do it.
All right. So I thought we would approach this as talking about running mechanics specifically. And when we're looking at the way a runner moves, there are a handful of common ways that running form can go wrong. And when I say go wrong, I mean you are putting a lot of energy into your running, and the way that you're moving is slowing you down. You are losing energy in the way that you're moving and the way that you're progressing. So I thought we would start with common problems that we see in runners' form, and how strength training can help us correct, fix, adjust for those errors to make us more efficient. So the first one I thought we'd start with is an overstride. This is really, really common. I think most runners have probably heard the term overstride before, but maybe don't necessarily know what that means. So I thought I'd start with correct form in your stride. When you are running, correct or most efficient running form is going to have your foot landing underneath your hips as you're moving forward. What a lot of people do, especially when they try to increase speed, we talk about opening your stride, lengthening your stride. What a lot of people do is reach forward. So they are reaching their legs such that their foot strikes the ground in front of their body, in front of their hips. Often that comes with a heel strike, but not necessarily. And that doesn't even really matter in terms of efficiency. But you're landing with your foot in front of your hips. So you are trying to move and push your body forward. You're rolling with momentum. Correct form, or your most efficient form, I want to stop saying correct. Your most efficient form is going to have your foot landing underneath your hips so that your forward momentum, as you're moving forward, you're moving with your momentum. You're continuing to push forward. When you land with your foot in front of your body, you're literally halting your momentum with every stride. Your foot strikes in front of your body. All of that force is traveling up your legs, into your hips, into your core, and stopping your momentum with every stride. So you're literally putting this energy into moving forward, but you're actually putting on the brakes and stopping yourself. If we can correct or improve upon that overstride, you can take the same amount of energy and move forward faster because you're not putting on the brakes every time that you hit the ground. I would say it's most common that I see this in people who are a little bit more sedentary, like people who work a desk job and maybe spend a lot of time sitting. That's not necessarily the rule, but that's probably most commonly where we see it. So if our goal is to pull our foot back underneath our body, part of that is going to be retraining a habit of the way that you move when you run. But what are some of the muscles that we can be working on and strengthening to support us in that form? Landing with your feet underneath your hips, getting more push and power off the back of your stride instead of reaching forward in front of your body. Thomas, why don't I throw that to you first? I have a bad
All
habit
right.
of just throwing out a question and not addressing it to someone.
I mean, your entire leg is going to be important for that process. You mentioned your core as well. The I like to think of it now. We've talked about it, kind of like falling forward and then being able to pick that foot up off the ground. Am I right in saying that? So definitely your hamstrings, they got to be
Mm-hmm.
strong. And then also your gastroc soleus, that lower part of the leg needs to be really strong to be able to absorb the multiple landings over and over and over again. So definitely posterior chain. Glutes come into that as well. Since you are doing extension on the backside, you want to be able to control that, especially as the leg swings back forward, and so that you do land with your foot right under your hips.
So, talking about the whole posterior chain, you mentioned gastroc and soleus. For those who don't know those terms, those are your calf muscles, the muscles of your lower leg that are pushing you off the ground, propelling you forward. So, when we're talking about strengthening the posterior chain, I think that one of the things I mentioned is we see an overstride commonly in people who spend a lot of time sitting. So you're sitting down in a chair, your whole, and especially if you're sitting with bad posture and rounding forward, your whole posterior chain is weak and maybe even like chronically extended. Um, but I would also say a lot of times what I hear people say is like, my hamstrings are really tight and they're chronically stretching their hamstrings, and then we get more, it's just that much easier to overstride when your hamstrings are chronically extended, and chronically weak at the same time. So how can how do we know the difference? Maybe this is where I can take that question. How do we know the difference between when we say a muscle is tight? What does that mean? Does that mean that we should be stretching that muscle, or is there something else that we should be doing to work on a tight muscle, especially if we know that it's extended? John, maybe I'll
John?
throw that one at you.
All right. Yeah, I can take that. I think that's a common concept that I talk with my clients a lot. Is um, that like tight versus short muscle. So a short muscle would be one that lacks extensibility and is creating a range of motion restriction. A tight muscle does not necessarily fall under that umbrella, right? So um, honestly, more times than not, and especially with our runners, we see those tight muscles. That tightness is actually a compensation for being weak. So our muscles, their main job is to produce force and provide stability for our body. And if they are weak, they get fatigued really quickly and can't do their job as effectively or efficiently as they should. So what they do to compensate for that is they start to tighten up to try to provide some sort of static stability because they don't provide as much dynamic stability as they should. So static being like stability at rest, and dynamic is stability during movement. So that feeling of tightness is actually that muscle being fatigued and compensating for being weak. So continuously stretching that is only going to further elongate it and further weaken it, so to speak. When in reality, what you need to do is get that muscle stronger so that it feels more supportive and can just relax, doesn't fatigue as much. Then you don't notice nearly as much of that compensation tightness. kicking in, because those people that you mentioned that are kind of chronically tight, right? They stretch all the time, but they always feel like their hamstrings are tight or their hips are tight. They stretch and stretch and stretch, and it feels good for a few minutes, even a few hours, but then it just comes right back. That typically is an indication that it's probably not a mobility problem. It's not a shortened muscle problem. It's a strength problem.
So is there something you can do if you're feeling that tightness, let's say, and it's like bothering you? Is there something that you can do to help alleviate that in between workout sessions that wouldn't necessarily be detrimental, like stretching maybe?
Yeah, I think that's where your soft tissue, myofascial release, self release kinds of things come in. The lacrosse ball, the foam roller, massage guns, those kinds of things. So you can manipulate that tissue without taking it through an elongation process. Get the elongation through loaded exercise. So you add some strength with that elongation. That's really what the best thing to do. But in terms of that, like, what do I need to do? What can I do right now to make it feel a little better? Is the foam roller, lacrosse ball, massage gun kind of stuff.
Okay, cool.
So if we want to strengthen those muscles, let's say, so with this issue specifically, Thomas, you mentioned we want to be strengthening your calves, your hamstrings, your glutes as probably the primary muscles to focus on in improving an overstride. What kind of exercises can we do that would strengthen those muscles instead of stretching?
Start off with your basic Romanian deadlift or a single leg RDL. Basic calf raises. You can do those for reps, or you can lower the reps and add some weight to those. I particularly like to do those single leg, especially if you're needing to get some strength in them. And then glutes, you got glute bridges. I really like lunges, and you can kind of load those so that you're targeting the glutes a little bit more. So yeah, those would be three basic ones, super simple ones that if you have any access to some dumbbells, you can do.
I feel like everything that we talked about fits me perfectly to a T. I have an office job. I'm very tight in these areas. But also I don't really sometimes know how to identify it because I am not necessarily tight, let's say in my hamstrings or my glutes when I go out there, but I know I'm weak in those areas. I've kind of put some focus on that. My question would be in relation to that is if I'm working a desk job, is there anything that I can do outside of the strength that I'm doing, let's say after work or before work? Like during my 8-hour workday, can I incorporate any simple things, whether it's standing up at my desk, doing anything body weight wise, right, to maybe combat some of these things that are causing the imbalances and weaknesses in me or anybody else that's got like a desk job? I don't know if I'm asking that question, if it's coming across right, but
No, I think
yeah.
that's a great question,
Yeah.
and I'll run with this real quick because it's a concept that I answer in my line of work pretty frequently. I think you hit the nail on the head. Like if you've got an 8-hour workday and you're sitting for most of that, setting a timer on your phone or on your computer to stand up, every 30 minutes or every hour, just depending on what the structure of your workday is. Um, just simply getting up and moving around a little bit can help combat that. But you can add as much into your day as you really want to. One of the best things, most important things, I would say, is like Lauren was saying, when you're sitting for that amount of time, you're just kind of in this hunched position. Everything on the front gets really tight, and everything in the back is maybe a little over elongated, so to speak. So doing something to just kind of open yourself up and get more in an extended posture, right? So Lauren was talking about the overstride concept, right? So like as you're trying to run faster, the tendency is you try to elongate your stride, cover more ground with each step, right? But we really don't want all of that coming from the front. You need to open it up and get some of that motion from the back, right? So you need to have back extension. So your spine needs to be able to move well enough into extension to allow that to happen in your running gait. Your hip needs to extend to allow that stride to lengthen without it all coming from the front. So just simply standing up and doing some back extension exercises would help with that. If you once an hour you did 10 squats or something like that, you're getting some glute and hamstring activation with those types of things. But more than anything, I think just moving as frequently as you can throughout the day is going to help combat that. Sitting at a desk for 8 hours is not going to be good for anyone. If you can get up, move around every 30 minutes, every hour at the minimum, that's going to help quite a bit.
I think that's a really good suggestion. One of the things I didn't hit on, we're talking about your posterior chain being so important so that you can be running as a pushing exercise rather than a pulling exercise. One thing that we missed, though, is hip flexors. So when you've got that overstride motion, a lot of what we see is sort of like a scissor stride. Like you're getting very little mobility from your knees. You're not lifting and driving from your knee very much. You're running relatively stiff-legged. Scissor stride is maybe exaggerating a little bit, but when you're sitting for that period of time, your hip flexors do shorten. They do shorten. They're still weak. You do still need to train those muscles so that you can get that knee drive at the front, but they are shortened in the way that they're weak. And so getting that, opening your hip flexors and standing up tall and letting those muscles open can be really helpful there too. That's a muscle that maybe it is helpful to do a little bit of stretching there to help to lengthen that muscle a little bit.
Yeah, and I think, again, we're talking about running specifically, right? So mobility of the posterior chain is less important in the grand scheme of things when we're talking about the hips. So, like, rarely, if ever, are you going to reach end range hip flexion during a running stride, right? But with every stride, you're going to reach end range hip extension, right? So you should. You have to have mobility in the front and strength in the back. And then, like you talked about with that knee drive pulling forward, that is where the hip flexor strengthening comes in. But you've got to have the mobility to be able to get that leg back behind you at that toe off in the running stride to again, be able to cover as much ground as you can and run as efficiently as possible.
Yeah, well, and that's how you go faster, is opening your stride at the back of your stride rather than reaching forward. The longer
Right.
you can open your stride, the faster you're able to move. A faster stride, you shouldn't be increasing your cadence. You're not moving your feet faster. You're lengthening the amount of ground that you cover. And that comes from the back, all from the push and the hip extension.
Yeah, and I liked your analogy in the intro about like a long stride all out in front. You're putting on the brakes every time. It's like driving a Ferrari that can go super, super fast, but every time you hit the gas, you then slam on the brakes, right? Like you're just not going to go very far, and you're going to wear your car out. Our bodies are really no different than that concept. It's going to slow you down, and from my perspective, I always go back to the injury stuff. But it's inefficient. You're going to run slower. It's going to impact your performance, but it's also going to increase your risk for injury for sure.
Right. So you have all of that force coming right back up, straight up the chain into your hips. And I think if I could add, if you put on super shoes while you're overstriding, your super shoe is designed to give more feedback. So when you hit the ground, you're getting more responsiveness off the ground. If you are overstriding while you're wearing a super shoe, all of that extra feedback is coming back up the chain into your hips. So that's a case where I would say, we've talked a little bit about super shoes before. If you know that you overstride, super shoes are not going to be helpful for you. They can even be detrimental for you in terms of the injury risk and all of that feedback coming back up the chain from the ground. Okay, the next The next common thing that we see, and a lot of people might not be aware that they're doing this unless you've had a form analysis, or maybe you've seen a race photo of yourself, or race photos are a pretty commonplace that people maybe see that something is wrong, but they're not quite sure what it is. This is a hip drop. So what a hip drop is essentially, your pelvis should be holding steady and level when you run. A hip drop is when your foot strikes the ground. This is really hard to demonstrate on my upper body. If I could give like a full body perspective, shoulders. You could see.
Use your shoulders.
Shoulders work. Okay. So this leg hits the ground. Your foot hits the ground on this side. This hip drops while the foot strikes on the opposite side. So your pelvis is essentially moving laterally when your opposite foot strikes the ground. So again, we're talking about when you hit the ground, we want all of that energy and momentum to continue moving forward. When your hip drops, you are essentially losing energy to a lateral movement. So you're getting more lateral sway rather than forward propulsion. Typically this is coming from, and you guys chime in and correct me if you feel differently or want to add on to it. It's often coming from weak lateral hip muscles that aren't supporting you as you strike the ground and as you're moving, trying to move forward. So again, sort of like the heel strike, you're putting a lot of energy into trying to move forward, and you're losing some of that energy to lateral motion rather than forward propulsion. So ideally, what we're looking for is for our pelvis to stay relatively level as we're moving forward. Your core essentially wants to resist movement rather than swaying as you move side to side. So what are some muscles that we need to work on and exercises that we can use to stabilize our pelvis as we're striding side to side? Thomas, I'll throw that one at you.
Yeah, I'll definitely start with the glutes, glute max, glute med, glute minimus. Some real basic ones that we utilize in the gym all the time is just a side plank with a hip abduction. So you take that top leg and you stack them and you just raise it up and down. Again, back to the lunges, any of your big movements, squats. I would say the QL also is part of that. That trunk, a lot of people don't think about it, but your lats tie in to your hips as well. So just the fact that someone can do a pull up or a chin up, that means you have pretty strong lats. That's going to play a role. That's going to kind of tie everything together. Bird dogs and any isometric core activity that you can think of. Planks, side planks, Copenhagen planks, you name it. All of those would work to strengthen that whole area around the hips.
So, go ahead, Scott.
I was just going to ask, is there any signs that a runner or an athlete can identify if there's any pain that they may be having, some hip issues? For example, like does low back pain correlate with that, specifically? Somebody gets done with a run and says, oh, my lower back really hurts. Is that a sign we can correlate to that's maybe where their weaknesses are? It could be something else, but is there any signs that, lead to that specifically?
Absolutely, and he can correct me if I'm wrong, but runner's knee, right? The TFL gets overworked. That's your hip taking on most of the work. And then we've had some low back stuff with some kids where they're maybe the glute med, he can correct me if I'm wrong, is really tight. So then we work on that, and the low back pain seems to dissipate as well. So it's a balancing act. I mean, this is why it's important to talk about it. But yeah, trying to figure out those sticking points.
Yeah, and I'll just like a little bit expand on that. I think, like you said, it couldn't be related, but it also could be related. I think the concept of regional interdependence is something that we have to keep in mind when it comes to injuries and performance, really. But basically what that is how one joint can impact and have an effect on another. So we talk about the ripple effect when it comes to injuries. So the ripple effect is like when you throw a stone in the water, there's going to be a ripple, right? The biggest ripple is right where it goes into the water, and then as it extends outward, the ripples get smaller. right? So when you're talking about low back and hip, if you have low back pain, then the hip is probably going to be a bigger ripple, right? It's the very next joint that's immediately attached to the lower back. So that, dysfunction at the hip is probably going to have a bigger impact to your lower back than your big toe, right? The big toe can still have an effect. It's just a smaller ripple effect, right? We're gonna try to clear out the bigger impact first, and then if symptoms continue, then maybe we extend that a little further down the chain. But I think that's a good kind of thought process to keep in mind, is that ripple effect. Joints above and below play the biggest role, and then you can extend beyond that.
I think another common area of pain that we tend to see, or even sometimes people aren't even having pain, but again, I referenced race photos. They get their race photos back and they think that their form looks ugly. Like they don't like it. They can see that they don't look the way that they think that they should. Another common thing we see when you have that hip drop going on and you have weak glute muscles, glute medius muscles, is your knee collapses inward. So pain wise, you can also have like IT band issues going on there. And from a visual, you'll see not only that your hip is dropping on the one side, but as your foot strikes the ground, the supportive side that's catching your weight, that knee collapses inward. So each stride, you're kind of seeing that knee is going inward. And you might also then see issues all the way down the chain to your ankle, to your feet. But that's a common, if you haven't had like a form analysis done and you see something going on in your pictures, that's a sign that maybe we need to be taking a look at how you're moving there.
Yeah, and go back to where you started. This was like the impact of that on your running economy, right? So now you've got, it's all about excessive movement, right? You're trying to be as efficient with your movement as possible. And if you're throwing in, that opposite side hip drop, and now you've got rotation or inward knee position, all of those are movements that aren't part of the normal running stride, right? Your muscles have to react and try to do something about that, which means that they're burning more energy. Running 26.2 miles is already incredibly taxing from an energy perspective. You don't need to, ideally, you're not wasting energy trying to control these extra movements that aren't really desirable in your running stride. So at the end of the day, it does all come back down to that running economy. If you want to run faster times, longer distances, you've got to correct those form issues and those strength imbalances to run as efficiently as possible.
Well, and I think you make a good point there about, when we're looking at distance and endurance, this is where strength really comes into play. Like you might, when you run that first 1, 2, 3 miles, your form might look beautiful. But as you fatigue in mile 20, 21, 22, that's where we see form fall apart because you're lacking the strength to continue to support your body. And that is a strength issue. That is something that we can work on in the gym rather than on the road, on the treadmill. That's a huge piece that it's later on. And I've had that issue myself. When I get tired, XYZ starts to fall apart.
I think a lot of people will misconstrue that and think, well, I'm getting fatigued, so I really should work on my endurance, right? My endurance needs to be better. But really, you get fatigued because your muscles break down too quickly early in the race, right? Like if you could build them up and they're stronger to start with, then each stride breaks them down a little bit less, so they last longer before fatigue sets in. So like that strength versus endurance spectrum is very correlated with each other, right? Like if you can get stronger, then your endurance lasts longer. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Okay, so the last form form item that I had, and this is a big one because this is maybe the most common thing that we see in general, and also as people fatigue, is the arm swing. A lot of people, when we're talking about running, are focused on your lower body and not necessarily aware of what's going on your upper body and how that affects how everything else down the chain moves. So I want to start with arm swing, but I mean, we can even talk about like posture and head position and where your chin and your eyes are looking. But a few of the most common things that we see in arm swing that are slowing you down and limiting your efficiency are wide elbows. And that usually is going to come with tight shoulders also. You're going to raise your shoulders up like this. And again, that happens most often when you're fatiguing. You don't necessarily start your run with your shoulders up here. Or when you're trying to do a faster effort, maybe you pull those shoulders up. As those shoulders come up, your elbows go out. And then you tend to get a lot more trunk rotation rather than arm swing when you have your elbows out wide. It's just not natural to swing your arms if your elbows are out that way. Sometimes, but not always, along with those wide elbows, then you get the arm swing crossing the body, crossing the midline, rather than a forward motion. Again, that doesn't necessarily mean your elbows are out pretty wide. Sometimes people keep their elbows in tight, but they still get that cross body swing, which again has your trunk rotating quite a bit. What we are going for, your most efficient form, is going to be driving from your elbow. So your elbow is leading the movement. You're driving backward. And a lot of people, I think, don't know that. We think of our arm swing and we're thinking about our hands, where our hands are. That's so much less important than where your elbow is. You're driving your elbow backward. And again, that's your range of motion so that you're not coming out wide this way. Your appendages are moving independently of your trunk. This is how you counterbalance your running stride rather than rotating from your chest, from your trunk. So what are some things, looking at the arm stride, if we are someone who chronically runs with our elbows out wide, what are some things that we can do to make it easier to pull those elbows back in, to hold your chest tall, hold your shoulders back, hold your elbows back, that we can work on to make that easier and more natural?
I'll throw this one out there. We use this with our kids a lot, our young kids that are 9 to 11 years old. If we're doing speed work and we're working on kind of running mechanics, we'll sit them on the ground, have them put their legs out straight, and just tell them, your hand needs to go cheek to cheek. But then we'll walk behind them and have them hit my hand with their elbow so they really understand, get your elbow back. And I think that's probably the first thing to start with. If you can sit down and do that, then you know it's all arm swing and your legs don't have anything to do with it. So you can kind of separate those, tease it out, and really drive home that technical aspect. Going back to sitting at the desk all day, that rounded posture, we've been talking about the hamstrings, but upper back, I mean, that's one of those things that's going to lengthen as well. So we want to do any kind of pulling activity, rows, band face pulls, cable pulls, whatever you can think of to kind of strengthen that backside. I think that's going to help as well. And then again, it's such a technical thing when you break it down, just ensuring that when you're out running, that what I'll tell them to do sometimes, if we do a sprint, I'll say, don't think about your legs. I want you to move your arms as fast as you can. And then they'll connect the dots. Okay, my arms are moving faster. Now my legs got to kind of move faster. So just really kind of diving in on that arm swing and paying attention to it.
I think that I like that you mentioned cheek to cheek as you're working on your arm swing, working on your pump. In marathon and ultra, we're looking at more, and this is a phrase I heard Scott Fobel use one time, and I loved it, so I stuck with it. Nipple to nipple is what you're looking at. If you are crossing your midline and going to the opposite side, then you're in trouble, but you're about nipple to nipple at marathon, ultra type pace. I like that. We're probably not getting all the way cheek to cheek on most of our running, unless you're sprinting for the finish line.
There you go. Yeah, and that's mostly with our speed work that we do that stuff. But yeah, I like nipple to nipple sounds much better.
And you're going to remember it because it kind of makes you chuckle, right? It's going to stick in your mind.
Right. So
Yeah, I
I'll
love
take
that.
I'll take this. Maybe kind of tie it back into what we were talking about earlier. One thing that I think this is a good example of how it's rarely, if you see a deficiency, it's rarely one thing, right? Like if Lauren, if you've assessed a runner's form and you see that they've got that chicken wing kind of posture, the first thing on your mind is, all right, we've got to get those elbows drawn in. Let's work arm swing. Let's work maybe some upper back strengthening to give them better posture, and hopefully that fixes it, right? But um, that can also be a compensation pattern for some lower body stability problems. I always use the analogy of the tightrope walker with, in the circus. They've got that long pole that they hold on to that's going horizontally, right? And that helps them balance themselves a little bit. So that's essentially what that chicken wing potentially is doing for, if they're unstable or weak in their lower half, they could be kind of chicken winging to help maintain some sort of balance and stability, and compensate for that. So um, again, regional interdependence, right? Like hit the things that are close by first. Um, but if it's not correcting itself, you start to look elsewhere and think outside the box, so to speak. Going back to the sprinting drill that Thomas was talking about, if they have no problem keeping their elbows tucked in when they're sitting on the floor and they do it perfectly, and then they get up and they immediately chicken wing again, that might make you think, all right, maybe there's a lower half thing going on here, because when they're sitting on the floor, you take your lower half out of it. So if they can maintain that posture and have perfect arm swing in a sitting position with no issues, but as soon as they start to run, it goes out to the side. Could be a compensation.
So, what are some good ways that you could kind of test that or challenge that then in the gym, like single leg exercises that make you balance and stabilize?
Yeah, I think it all comes down to like the same concepts that we've talked about for all of them, right? I mean, that's the great thing about that, like, kind of coined the term functional fitness, which, I mean, that's what it's all about. Like, a deadlift works so many different things. It's not one specific thing, right? It can be implemented for so many different things. Single leg RDLs, glute bridges, lunges, all those things that we've talked about. You're going to get multiple effects and impact a lot of different muscle groups and movement patterns by doing those types of exercises. So I don't think it's necessarily one or two specific exercises that you would do for that. It's just all part of the comprehensive programming.
I think it's worth mentioning too. The strength work that I do with my athletes is entirely online. It is, I hand them workouts. What's different about what you guys are doing is that it's in person. You are going through your workout with eyes that are supervising what you're doing, the way that you're moving. Because I think we're throwing out a lot of exercise ideas. But if your mechanics in the way that you're doing those exercises is off, then it's not going to benefit you as much as it should be or could be. And I think we've seen athletes have these kind of challenges that, they've got a set of 10 lunges that they need to do, and they just go through the motion and do it. But they're not aware that when they're doing that movement, they're maybe not completely aligned well on their hip, or, when they're doing a single leg exercise, they're swaying way out to the side to try to balance and hold themselves. So really being aware of, or having someone look at and supervise your mechanics while you lift and while you're in the gym and doing all of these exercises to try to improve your form is huge. And that's something that you guys are doing that is unique, especially for the athlete to have those eyes on the way that they're moving every time that they are lifting.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's something I talk to my clients a lot as I'm kind of starting the transition from the rehab to the performance side of things is, you know, doing the right exercise is one piece to the puzzle. So the programming is important, right? You need to do the right exercises. You need to pick or select the right exercises. But even more important is that you've got to do the right exercise correctly. Otherwise, you're just reinforcing bad movement patterns if you're not doing it correctly. I think athletes, we are the absolute best at compensating for our deficiencies, right? That's what I think makes athletes so much harder to treat from a rehab standpoint than maybe a gen pop type of client, because athletes compensate really, really well. They learn how to move around their deficiencies to accomplish the goal. So you have to nitpick them a little bit more and really have be pretty critical of their movement sometimes to make sure that they're not compensating.
Yeah, Michelle and I were having pretty much the same conversation last night. And in terms of, especially in a sport like running that's momentum based, and it's in any given run, you have thousands upon thousands of repetitions of your movement pattern, that when you are compensating, it's so easy for it to feel normal and for you not to be aware of it. And making the changes to those movement patterns is really difficult because of the number of repetitions that you've got to go through. And I think, if you don't mind me, throwing you out there as an example, that was a struggle that we had this year in terms of just having someone take a look at the way that you were moving in your strength work, and realizing, oh my gosh, I was not activating this correctly. I was not using this correctly.
Right.
And what a huge difference that's made in your running health.
Yeah, so like I had, when I had an injury earlier this year, and it took basically a super computer camera to catch my hip drop, because it wasn't a lot. It was only a few millimeters, but over the course of several marathon training cycles resulted in an injury. It's amazing. Like 2 millimeters made all the difference. But to relearn my form and do the strength stuff, I mean, it was like 2 months before it felt normal, because you're untrained. He's like a new runner. I feel like if you start them off on the right path, that's all they know. They've known, this is how we run. We start off, this is a good running form. They're learning it much faster than undoing 20 years of running at the same time as learning an entire new movement pattern. It was like, I felt like Bambi. Like, got there, I was like, I don't know how to run anymore. This is horrible. And it was like millimeters, but it's amazing how many repetitions. It probably took me about 2 months to feel good in my skin again on a run. It's crazy. But I was doing movement patterns wrong because Lauren wasn't watching me. I was doing her program remotely, and as soon as they get there, they're like, you're using every muscle but your glutes. Like, what are you doing? So.
And I think that experience will help you as a coach, right? When your clients are going through that same thing and they're frustrated with, I don't even know how to run anymore. This is like, what is the deal, right? Like you can speak from experience and say, look, just trust the process, because just like anything else in this world, like the correct way of doing something is not the fast way typically, right? It takes patience and consistency to get the results that you're ultimately looking for. People promise quick fixes all the time, but they're just not going to stick. You've got to have patience and consistency to get those things to hold long term, and that's what we preach on a day-to-day basis, and I know you guys preach that as well. So now you've got that firsthand experience, so you can talk your clients off the ledge and just trust the process, stay patient with it. We're going to get you there.
Yeah, for sure. It was definitely a learning experience. So
It's hard. Well, and I think ultimately the message that we want to send out is, don't wait until you're hurt to take those steps. That these are resources that are available to runners before you have an injury. Get your form evaluated, have someone take a look, and you can do it yourself. You can take a video of yourself running and take a look at these things that we mentioned today. You take a side view video, like set up your cell phone, put it on slow-mo. Everybody has slow-mo on their cell phone in 2024. Run past it and take a look as you're running at a side view. Is your foot landing in front of your hips? And then turn and take a forward and backward view. And you can take a look at when you're running away from the camera, you can see, look at your shirt line or your pants line. And that is the easiest way to see it. If you're getting that hip drop, if your pelvis is swaying to one side or another, you'll be able to see your arm swing from the front or the back and how that's lining up for you. You can do those things for yourself. It might take some extra guidance to understand how to correct it and the cues and the tools that you can use to fix those things. But you can take a look by yourself and be aware of it. And then the next step that you can be taking before you get hurt is to get into the gym. Have someone look at your form. Have someone take you through, like Thomas, a full strength training protocol and look at the way that you're moving and help you to dial in on the mechanics of your strength training also, to make sure that you're doing things correctly and progressing your strength in an appropriate way, in a way that's not going to hurt you over time.
And I would say, like, when you talk about form videos, to do it before and after a run, like a long run or a workout, because your fatigue form is going to probably look different. And so, like, I'm just going to use my example. Like, my form was pretty good at the start of my runs, but it was those end of the run. So it took a while to catch what was happening, because it was at the end of the run that it would deteriorate. I mean, everyone's does, but drastically. So, like, taking the videos at the start and finish is where we were able to nail that. Like, wait a second, you get tired. Your hip is, like, dropping.
Yeah.
Like, where I wasn't doing it when I would go fresh in and get an analysis. They're like, I don't know, looks pretty good. But, after 6 miles of speed work, it was completely trashed. So just advice.
This is another place where I think I've used this example several times already, but race photos are so valuable, because a lot of times, okay, I'm recommending you set up your cell phone and take a video. But I guarantee you, as you run past your phone, you're going to be like, pulling everything in the right way and you're trying to make it look good. A lot of times in race photos, especially if it's a big race where they take a lot, you're not aware of every photographer and where they are. So you are going to get some honest photos of the way that your body is landing and moving along the way. I had this issue last year, the Marine Corps Marathon. There's like 50 photographers along the course. So I had like 100 photos from race day, and I was having a hip drop issue, and you could see it. You could see the progression over the course of the race of like, man, I looked so strong at 13, 14, 15. And then there's some, 24, 25 that were just ugly. And that's an honest, when am I taking a video of myself at mile 24, 25 and seeing how my form looks? So yeah, those can be another honest assessment of how you're moving when no one's looking and when you're really fatigued. All right, man, that was everything on my checklist. Do you guys have any questions or any points that you want to highlight or talk about?
I guess one thing, just to go back, I think we sporadically kind of threw out the term injury prevention again, right? So it tends to come out when I talk, because that's the world I live in. But just to like really reinforce that improving your performance and doing things to prevent injury are essentially the same thing, right? It's not I need to be on a performance training program or I should be on an injury prevention program, right? Performance training is injury prevention. If all of the things that are going to help you run faster, run longer, more efficiently are also going to help reduce your injury risk. So go out there and do the things that you need to do to run faster.
I like that. Yeah. That's a good way to wrap it up. All right. So we are talking about getting in and getting evaluated, getting help before there's a problem. So tell us again, where can we find Elite Performance Institute?
Hit it, Burge.
You remember the address? No, we're on the north end of town. We're in the old Snavely's building, if anybody knows what that is. What is it? 19719 Leitersburg Pike.
19719 Leitersburg
There it
Pike.
is.
Yep.
How about online? Where can they contact you or follow you? You guys have had a lot of good social media stuff out lately.
Shoot, I always forget. Our Instagram is MD Elite Performance. Our Twitter is MD Elite, and Facebook is same thing, Elite Performance Institute, maybe / Maryland, and then online mdeliteperformance.com.
All right. And we are moremilestogo.com. You can find us on all social media platforms at More Miles Run Coaching, or on Spotify or wherever you listen to podcasts. We are at the More Miles Podcast. All right. Thanks for joining us, guys. This was a great conversation. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.